AITA for not wanting to share my lottery win with my siblings. And now my family is furious with me? Winning the lottery wasn't something I'd ever really thought about, let alone counted on. It was one of those things you dream about in passing. Something that always happens to other people. A news story you hear from afar. But then, one random afternoon, I found myself staring down at a winning lottery ticket. The numbers lined up perfectly, as if daring me to believe what I was seeing. It was a feeling I can only describe as complete disbelief mixed with an electric rush of excitement. The day had started out like any other, full of little errands and a long to-do list. I'd been at the store to grab some milk and bread, and on a whim, I decided to buy a lottery ticket. I don't usually play, it's not something I think about regularly. But I remember thinking, why not? A few bucks for a little bit of hope. As I scratched off the numbers later that evening, I had to double-check, then triple-check. Before it really hit me, I'd won. It wasn't the kind of jackpot that makes headlines or changes the course of a family tree forever. But it was enough to make a real difference. Enough to change things for my son and me in a way that felt like a second chance. For the first time in a long time, I felt the possibility of financial freedom, of breathing a little easier, of finally setting up the kind of security I'd only imagined. After the initial shock wore off, I did what felt natural. I called my mom. She was the first person I thought of, the one I wanted to share this wild, unbelievable news with. I remember feeling giddy, a bit breathless as I told her, waiting to hear her reaction, expecting excitement and maybe a bit of shock. At first, she sounded genuinely happy for me, laughing in surprise, asking questions in that disbelieving, happy way that felt good. But then, not even a minute later, she brought up a question I hadn't even considered. So, are you planning on sharing it with the family? She asked. Her voice curious but with an edge that made me pause. I wasn't sure what to say. I hadn't even fully processed the win myself. Hadn't thought beyond the fact that my son's future was about to feel a whole lot more secure. The idea of splitting it up or even giving some of it away hadn't crossed my mind in those first minutes of pure excitement. I felt a strange pang in my gut, like the reality of the situation had shifted somehow. I told her, cautiously, that I didn't think I would be sharing the money. I had plans for it already, setting up a fund for my son, covering debts that had built up over the years, maybe even allowing myself a small cushion to actually breathe a little. But the moment I said it, I felt the energy shift on her end of the line. There was a brief silence, a pause thick with judgment. And then she responded, her tone flat. Well, that's really disappointing. It wasn't the reaction I'd expected. And it hit me like a bucket of cold water. The joy, the excitement, it all felt like it had been suddenly stripped away, leaving me with a knot of confusion and, oddly enough, guilt. My mom's question about sharing the winnings replayed in my head long after our call ended. I'd expected her to be happy for me, to maybe even laugh with me over the sheer absurdity of my luck. Instead, her voice echoed in my mind, that's really disappointing. It wasn't long before that disappointment rippled through the family. Within a day, both my siblings had texted me, each message filled with excitement mixed with thinly veiled expectation. My brother's message read, "Wow, can't believe my sis hit the jackpot. Drinks on you, right?" My sister chimed in shortly after, congratulating me but adding that she could use a little pick-me-up for some expenses. The idea that I'd share with them seemed automatic, something they assumed went without saying. Their subtle hints soon turned into outright assumptions that I'd divide the winnings. I felt a strange disconnect reading their messages, like we were all reacting to two very different versions of the same news. Some context made this reaction sting more than it might have otherwise. My relationship with my siblings had always been, well, distant, for lack of a better word. My brother and sister were friendly enough, but over the years, they hadn't exactly been involved in my life. They knew my son has autism and that raising him as a single mom had its own set of challenges. Yet, they'd never been the type to check in, offer support, or even acknowledge the sacrifices I'd had to make. When I needed help or just someone to talk to, they were more likely to be out with friends or focused on their own lives. It was an unspoken reality that I'd learned to accept. I was mostly on my own. When my son was first diagnosed, I remember calling my mom, barely able to keep it together, and hoping that my family would rally around us. But support came in half-hearted promises or distant reassurances. My mom, though loving in her own way, would often excuse my siblings' absence with a dismissive, "You know they have their own lives." Over time, I stopped asking for their involvement. It was easier than dealing with the disappointment. So, when my family immediately asked about sharing the lottery winnings, it felt almost surreal. Where was this "family sticks together" sentiment when I was struggling? My mind flashed back to nights I'd stayed up with my son, navigating meltdowns alone, balancing work, appointments, and therapies without ever hearing a peep from them. The idea that they now wanted a slice of my good fortune was almost insulting. As I thought about it more, I realized that, deep down, I didn't want to share the money, not out of greed, but out of a need to finally prioritize myself and my son. This money represented a chance to build a future for us, to secure something I'd never felt before: stability. I wanted to pay off debts that had been weighing on me, set up a trust for my son, and maybe have a cushion so I didn't have to live paycheck to paycheck anymore. Still, the guilt was there, creeping in as my siblings' messages grew bolder and my mom subtly added pressure. She began calling daily, bringing up family values, and how we should all celebrate this win together. She even threw in reminders of how they'd all been proud of me when things were tough. As if their distant words of encouragement were enough to justify their entitlement now. The irony was painfully clear to me. They were proud of me as long as I was struggling and humble. But now, with a bit of luck on my side, that pride twisted into expectation. The thought of saying no to my family left me with a tightness in my chest. I knew they wouldn't take it well, but the resentment was building, simmering beneath the surface, making me realize that their immediate response revealed more about our family dynamic than I'd wanted to admit. And I couldn't ignore that. This time, I was on the edge of making a decision that would finally prioritize me and my son, without letting guilt steer the wheel. It didn't take long for my refusal to share the winnings to create a rift within the family. My initial reluctance, gently expressed to my mom, quickly snowballed into something bigger as word spread. My brother and sister's hints turned into outright accusations. Their subtle nudges transformed into full-blown pressure. My brother called first, his tone cheerful but edged with something sharper. "Hey, heard the news?" he started, casually at first. "I mean, wow, isn't it great? You've got this chance to finally share a bit with us. We're all super happy for you." I could hear it clearly, the unspoken expectation that I'd fork over a portion. When I hesitated, saying something about how I was planning to use the money for my son's future, he cut me off, chuckling as if I'd said something ridiculous. "You're not really going to just keep it all to yourself, are you? I mean, this is huge. Think of what this could do for all of us." When I mentioned, again, my plans for my son and paying off some debts, he grew quiet, the forced friendliness in his voice slipping. "You're really letting money go to your head," he finally muttered. "I always thought you were better than that." His words left me feeling both angry and hollow. But I reminded myself why I'd made the choice. My son, my peace of mind, they were worth more than anyone's expectations. Then came my sister, and her response was harsher. She texted me later that same day. But unlike my brother's attempts at casual persuasion, she came in hot. Her message was blunt. "I don't know why you're being so selfish. This could bring us closer as a family, and you're throwing it away for your own comfort." The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had never shown a united front when I needed them. When things were difficult, when I was navigating life as a single mom with a child who needed more attention and resources, they'd been silent, uninvolved. But now that money was involved, I was suddenly ruining the family by prioritizing my needs over theirs. Their criticism kept escalating. My brother told me over the phone, "I don't know who you think you are now, but money has definitely changed you." My sister's texts grew longer, loaded with insinuations that I was turning my back on the family, choosing money over love. Each message, each accusation, chipped away at me, feeding an internal battle between guilt and self-worth. I began questioning if I was truly doing the right thing by holding firm. Even my mom added to the pressure in subtle ways. Her disappointment always just below the surface. Her frequent calls to check in quickly shifted to a familiar refrain. Family takes care of family. She would say it so often that it became a mantra. A line she clearly hoped would sway me. I couldn't help but wonder where that sentiment had been when I was struggling alone. When I needed support that never came. One evening, she pulled out all the stops. Think about your son, she said. He needs a strong family around him. A community he can rely on. By refusing to share, you're not just hurting us, you're hurting him, too. Her words felt like tiny daggers, aimed at my deepest fears and insecurities as a mother. I knew my son needed support. But hadn't I been giving him all of that on my own? Where was this strong family when I'd been the one reaching out? Trying to create that very support network? It was surreal to be accused of tearing down something that had never been there in the first place. The tension continued to build, each conversation making it clear that I was expected to give, to fold under the weight of their disappointment and resentment. It felt like an unspoken battle, their entitlement against my resolve. Their accusations against my hopes for a stable future for my son. The very thing they accused me of, letting money change me, was the same thing I saw happening to them. This lottery win had twisted something in all of us, pulling apart bonds that were already stretched thin. As their pressure mounted, I found myself retreating, keeping more to myself and trying to avoid conversations that veered toward guilt trips and demands. I wanted peace, but every encounter left me drained. The sting of their words following me long after the calls ended. And yet, despite the pain and guilt they stirred up, I kept returning to the simple truth that this money could change everything for my son and me. For once, I had a real chance to provide for his future, to create a safety net for the both of us. It was a rare, precious opportunity I couldn't squander, not to appease people who had never been there when I needed them. So, despite the mounting resentment and the words they hurled my way, I held firm, knowing that the choice I was making wasn't easy, but it was right. The family pressure was unrelenting, and each passing day seemed to bring new messages or comments, each one carefully crafted to make me question myself. My brother and sister's direct accusations were exhausting, but my mom's approach was somehow harder to bear. She rarely confronted me directly about the money after that first conversation. Yet she managed to weave her disappointment into nearly every call, each interaction laced with subtle hints about family values and the importance of keeping us all close. She'd make offhand remarks about how money can tear families apart if people aren't careful, or how we're blessed when we share our blessings. There was always a hint of reproach in her voice, and it worked its way into me like poison, making me second-guess my decision. She reminded me constantly of my siblings' financial struggles, though I knew for a fact that my brother's choices were his own and that my sister's spending habits leaned toward extravagance. Yet here I was, carrying the weight of their struggles as if they were somehow my fault. Family takes care of family, my mom would repeat, her words leaving me feeling isolated and cornered. It was the phrase she always returned to, as though it were a magic spell that would break my resolve and make me fold to their demands. I couldn't ignore how much it hurt to have my own mother frame my decision as a betrayal. Like my refusal to share my winnings was a direct attack on her. On my siblings. On the very idea of family. With each call, my internal conflict grew. I'd spent so long handling everything on my own, working hard to provide for my son, never asking for their help. But now, I was torn between guilt and an aching desire to protect this newfound security. The truth was that I didn't want to give in, but the pressure to be the good daughter, the selfless sister, was seeping into me, making me wonder if I was somehow in the wrong. I started to question if I'd become too hard, too protective of my independence. My family's words echoed in my mind, telling me that money had changed me, that I'd become selfish, and there was a part of me, small but persistent, that began to believe them. Was I really being too harsh? Should I try to help them in some way? I wrestled with those questions in quiet moments, weighed down by the realization that my loyalty to my son and myself felt, to them, like an act of betrayal. But as I went over each memory, I couldn't ignore the reality of the past. I thought about all the times I'd needed them. The countless moments I'd spent struggling on my own, wishing for a support system that never materialized. When I needed help with my son, when I needed someone to check in, to care, where were they then? Every time I'd reached out, every time I'd hoped for even a small gesture, I'd been met with excuses or silence. Now that I had something to give, they expected me to be generous and selfless. But it felt hollow, hypocritical even. The guilt they'd stirred up in me was real, but it was layered with a bitterness I couldn't shake. I was tired of feeling like I owed them something, simply because we shared blood. Because society expects family bonds to come with unconditional sacrifice. I'd already sacrificed so much, my time, my energy, my mental well-being, to keep everything together for my son. I was done sacrificing myself for people who only seemed to care when there was something for them to gain. Despite all the guilt, a small voice inside kept reminding me that protecting my son's future was my priority. This wasn't about revenge or payback for years of neglect. It was about finally setting aside the good daughter expectations and choosing a path that would make my life and my son's life better. I'd spent years putting others first, bending over backward to keep the peace. But I couldn't do it this time. By prioritizing my son and our future, I wasn't failing my family, I was fulfilling a duty to myself and to him. And although their disapproval hurt, I knew I had to stay strong. This money was a chance for us to breathe, to plan, to live with less worry. And that was worth holding onto, no matter how much they tried to convince me otherwise. As the weeks went on, my relationship with my mom grew strained in ways I hadn't anticipated. What had once been casual conversations, light check-ins about my son or my work, shifted into something heavy and fraught. I could feel the tension settling into each call, the subtle disappointment coloring everything she said. She rarely addressed the money directly anymore, but her words and tone conveyed a constant, unspoken disapproval. One evening, she called, her voice low and calm but unmistakably weighted with reproach. She started with a familiar line, "You know, family is all we have in this world." I sighed, already bracing myself, knowing this conversation was going to leave me more exhausted than ever. "Family is all we have," she repeated, "and we don't choose them. But we have to stand by them. I know you're in a position to help now. And I don't understand why you're pulling away from us when we could all grow closer through this." Her words struck a deep, aching chord within me. I'd spent years wanting to feel close to my family, to experience that bond she described. But it had always felt one-sided. An illusion of closeness maintained only when I was willing to make sacrifices and keep the peace. I knew she saw my refusal to share as a rejection of that bond, a betrayal of everything she'd raised us to value. And part of me wanted to explain, to make her understand why I was holding back. But when I tried to explain, she cut me off, her tone turning sharp, defensive. "You don't get to turn your back on us just because you're lucky enough to have a little bit of money now. I thought I raised you better than that." Her words were like tiny daggers, chipping away at the confidence I'd worked so hard to build around my decision. She was making it about loyalty, about family honor, about the values she believed I was betraying. She pressed on, reminding me how she'd supported me, in her own way, over the years. She spoke of the pride she'd felt when I became a mother, when I managed to hold things together on my own. But each mention felt hollow, colored by the knowledge that her support had often come from a distance. Never fully engaged, never truly present. She spoke as if I owed her, as if her limited support in the past should obligate me to generosity now. "Your son needs a family around him," she said finally, her voice softening into something almost pleading. "He needs to grow up knowing that he has people who care about him. Do you really want to push us all away because of money?" Her words touched a raw nerve. I did want my son to feel connected, to have a family he could rely on. But I couldn't ignore the hypocrisy in her statement. Where had that commitment been when I was struggling? When I needed help beyond her distant encouragement? Her definition of family was one that only seemed to surface when it was convenient for them. And I couldn't let myself be drawn into a version of family that didn't feel genuine. A sudden surge of emotion rose in me, and for the first time, I found myself pushing back. I told her that while I appreciated her concern, My priority had to be my son's future, especially considering his unique needs. I explained, as calmly as I could, that this money represented a chance for us to finally have a stable life, free from constant financial worry. But as I spoke, I could feel her growing colder, shutting herself off from my words. "Well, I hope you're happy with yourself," she said finally, her tone like ice. I never thought I'd see the day where my own daughter chose money over family. It's just disappointing. And then, with a heavy sigh, she hung up, leaving me with a bitter silence. The weight of that call lingered long after. For days, her words replayed in my mind, the disappointment and disapproval settling like a heavy stone in my chest. Her final line, "I hope you're happy with yourself," reverberated through me, filling me with guilt and sadness. Even as I clung to the conviction that I was doing the right thing for my son, I began to wonder if things would ever go back to normal with her. If this decision would forever change the dynamic between us. I realized, painfully, that she saw my independence as a threat to the family structure she'd always upheld. A structure that required loyalty, submission, and sacrifice on my part, while offering little in return. The fact that I was standing firm now felt, to her, like a betrayal. But as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't let her words dictate my choices. My son's well-being was more important than preserving an illusion of harmony that only served the needs of others. I was coming to terms with the fact that, perhaps, the closeness I'd hoped for with my family might never be realized, and that was okay. In that moment, I resolved to focus on the life I was building for myself and my son. To prioritize a future where I didn't have to apologize for putting our needs first. The strain with my mom might take time to heal, or it might remain as it was. But either way, I knew I was making the right choice, even if it came at the cost of her approval. For the first time, I felt a hint of freedom in that realization, a freedom that came from choosing, unapologetically, to protect what truly mattered. With my mom's disappointment now an unspoken weight in every interaction, my siblings quickly followed suit, making sure I knew how they felt about my decision to keep the lottery winnings for myself and my son. It was as if they were competing with each other to be the most offended. Each phone call, text, and social media post another layer in a mounting wall of accusations and resentment. Their entitlement to the money wasn't even hidden anymore, it was the foundation of every interaction we had. My brother, always the charmer, started with attempts at guilt disguised as humor. "So, you're just going to keep it all? Man, must be nice," he'd say in a tone that might have sounded like a joke to an outsider but was unmistakably serious to me. He'd laugh off my refusals, but I could feel the bitterness underneath. He even hinted at his financial struggles, mentioning how he'd lost so much in the last year, and how a little extra could help him get back on his feet. The casual nature of his requests hid a familiar truth. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was demanding what he thought he was owed. My sister, on the other hand, didn't bother with subtlety. She sent me a long, emotionally charged message detailing how difficult things had been for her and how she couldn't believe I would choose to hoard the money instead of helping family. She painted herself as the victim, turning my decision to prioritize my son's future into a betrayal of sibling loyalty. She even brought up old memories of childhood, framing them as proof of a bond that, in her mind, required me to give back now. "Remember when we were kids? How we were always there for each other," she wrote. "You act like we didn't have a connection. Like I haven't been there for you when you needed someone." I reread that line several times, feeling the irony bite. As much as I wanted to believe in that connection, my reality had been very different. In the moments when I'd truly needed her, she'd been distant, just as wrapped up in her own life as my brother. With each accusation, my siblings brought up memories, twisting them into reasons I should be giving them money. But all they did was unearth old resentments that I'd long since buried. I remembered times I'd called them, reaching out during difficult periods in my life, hoping for a helping hand or even just a listening ear, and how often those calls had gone unanswered. They'd never shown up, not when my son was diagnosed, not when I was trying to manage his needs alone, not when I struggled with endless bills and appointments. My sister, in particular, had been good at finding reasons to avoid being involved. She'd always have a busy work schedule, a last-minute trip, some excuse that kept her comfortably detached from the reality of my life. And yet, now that there was money on the line, she had suddenly rediscovered her connection to me, weaving stories of sibling loyalty as if our past had been marked by unbreakable bonds rather than polite indifference. Each interaction felt like a forced journey through years of disappointment, with every word they spoke only confirming the truth I'd tried so hard to ignore. My siblings' support was conditional. They'd been absent when I needed them most. And now, with my lottery win, they were only present because there was something to gain. The hardest part was realizing how much I'd clung to the idea of family unity. Even when I knew it wasn't real, I'd always wanted to believe that if things were different, if we weren't all wrapped up in our own lives or weighed down by obligations, we could have a real connection. But their entitlement to my winnings shattered that hope, showing me that our family ties were threads they were willing to sever the moment they didn't get what they wanted. As the demands grew louder, I knew I had to confront this reality. My siblings weren't just asking for money, they were trying to rewrite history, framing themselves as my support system despite years of distance and absence. And I couldn't let them do it. I'd spent too long justifying their lack of involvement, telling myself that people get busy, that life happens, that family doesn't have to be perfect to be valuable. But seeing their true colors now, I realized I was holding onto an idea that had never been real. It was painful, acknowledging that my siblings saw me more as a bank than a sister. But in that pain, there was a strange clarity. This was the wake-up call I hadn't wanted but desperately needed. I could no longer pretend that our family bond was enough to justify their expectations or that I owed them something simply because we shared a last name. The resentment that had been bubbling under the surface finally had an outlet. And while it was hard to face, it was also liberating. For the first time, I felt free from the weight of their expectations, free to prioritize my son and myself without guilt. This lottery win had exposed the cracks in our relationships, but it had also given me the courage to protect what truly mattered. From that point on, I resolved to draw boundaries that couldn't be crossed, to define my life and my choices on my own terms. I loved my family, but I couldn't sacrifice my well-being or my son's future to appease their sense of entitlement. I wasn't just protecting my money, I was protecting my peace, my independence, and the life I was building for us. And despite the pain of facing the truth, I knew it was the right choice. With the strain from my family reaching its peak, I turned to the people who had shown up for me consistently, my friends. While family loyalty had always been a part of my identity, I knew I couldn't navigate this alone. My friends had been my support system for years, helping me through countless challenges with my son, celebrating my small victories, and lending an ear without expectations. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was them. One evening, after yet another argument with my sister, I reached out to a few close friends. We met at a quiet coffee shop. And as I recounted everything, winning the lottery, my family's reactions, the relentless pressure, I felt a weight lift just having people listen without judgment. They didn't interrupt or offer advice right away, they just listened, nodding in that way that makes you feel seen and understood. I could feel the kindness and acceptance in their silence. And for the first time since my win, I felt validated. After I finished, my friend Amy, who'd been there through a lot of my struggles with my son, leaned forward and said gently, "I'm so sorry you're going through this. But remember, you've done everything for your family. You've always been there for them, even when they weren't there for you. If they're upset now, that's on them, not on you." Her words hit deep, reminding me of the endless sacrifices I'd made to hold everything together. To be the good daughter and sister even when it meant neglecting my own needs. Another friend, Mark, put it more bluntly, "It sounds like they're just looking at you as a meal ticket now. If they weren't there when you needed them, then they have no right to demand anything from you now." His directness might have seemed harsh to some, but I appreciated the clarity. He was seeing the situation for exactly what it was, without the emotional fog I'd been trapped in. His straightforward assessment was both liberating and empowering, giving me permission to view my family's expectations without the guilt that had been weighing me down. Over the next hour, my friends reminded me of the person I'd been before the lottery win. Before the guilt and accusations took over, they told me I was resilient, that I'd worked incredibly hard to be there for my son, and that prioritizing his future was not only right but necessary. They pointed out that, while family ties are significant, they aren't a justification for entitlement or mistreatment. And for the first time in weeks, I felt my sense of self returning, piece by piece. My friend Sarah said something that stayed with me long after that evening. She told me, "You've built a family with us, too. Family isn't just blood, it's who shows up. Who's there when you need them. We're here for you. No strings attached." Her words hit deep, reminding me of the countless ways my friends had supported me without expecting anything in return. They'd helped me when I was overwhelmed with my son's needs, celebrated small wins in my career, and encouraged me during times I doubted myself. In every meaningful way, they'd been there for me more than my family ever had. Leaving the coffee shop that night, I felt a renewed sense of confidence. My friends' words had given me permission to let go of the toxic expectations my family had placed on me and embrace a life that didn't require constant sacrifice. They'd helped me see that I wasn't alone, that there were people who valued me for me, not for what I could give them. Their encouragement bolstered my resolve to move forward with my plans to secure my son's future. To set up the fund that would provide for his unique needs without relying on anyone else's support. My friends reminded me that I wasn't being selfish or greedy. I was finally claiming the independence and security I'd worked so hard to achieve. In the days that followed, I held onto their advice as a shield against the guilt and accusations my family continued to throw my way. With each message from my siblings or subtle jab from my mom, I remembered Sarah's words, "Family is who shows up." And I realized that, no matter how much my biological family protested, I already had a family built on love, respect, and support. Thanks to my friends, I felt empowered to prioritize the future I was building for myself and my son. And with that clarity, I knew I could face whatever came next with a strength I hadn't felt in years. After that evening with my friends, I was able to breathe a little easier, to see past the web of guilt and obligation that had clouded my vision since winning the lottery. Their words grounded me, reminding me that this money wasn't just a windfall to distribute, it was a chance to secure a life for my son. To protect his future in ways I'd always dreamed of but never had the means to accomplish. With this clarity, I allowed myself to focus on what mattered most, my son's well-being and stability. In all honesty, the most fulfilling part of this win was the chance it offered to finally plan for my son's future without that constant undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. Raising him as a single mother had been challenging in so many ways. But his diagnosis added layers of complexity I hadn't anticipated. Over the years, I'd become skilled at managing his routines, therapies, and needs. But every decision was tinged with worry about what would happen if something unexpected derailed our delicate balance. For the first time, I felt a profound sense of relief knowing I could set up a trust for him, something that could ensure he'd have a safety net. Even if I wasn't always able to be there for him in the ways he needed. I started researching special needs trusts, learning how they could protect his financial future while allowing him to remain eligible for essential programs and benefits. It was overwhelming at times, the legal language and requirements a foreign world to me, but I took comfort in knowing that I was putting something concrete in place for him. Beyond the trust, I made plans to use a portion of the money for therapy and educational resources that might help him develop skills to lead a more independent life. This wasn't just about the immediate expenses. I wanted to invest in programs and opportunities that could help him grow and adapt, giving him the tools he'd need to thrive on his own terms. The thought of providing him with these resources, of giving him opportunities I'd only been able to dream of until now, filled me with a joy that outweighed any lingering doubts from my family's reactions. And there was more, things I'd been putting off for years, quietly worrying about. Medical expenses. For one, the bills had added up over time, each one a reminder of how close we always were to financial strain. Paying off those bills, clearing the slate, meant I could focus fully on my son without the constant, gnawing anxiety of debt hanging over us. I even began to dream a little about small comforts I could afford now, having a reliable car that wouldn't break down, upgrading our modest home so my son had more space to play and grow. creating a space that felt like a sanctuary for both of us. These weren't luxuries, they were essentials I'd always struggled to afford. Things I knew would make our lives more stable and joyful. As I started putting these plans into place, I felt a quiet but profound sense of peace. My heart swelled with gratitude each time I thought of the future I could now build for my son. One where he was protected, supported, and loved in the ways he needed most. And with each decision, each step toward that future, my resolve grew stronger. This money was for us, my son and me, and I wouldn't let anyone or anything take that away. My family's words still lingered in my mind, but they were softened by this newfound clarity. I understood now that their disappointment wasn't mine to carry. Their views on family loyalty and obligation had no place in the life I was building. I was prioritizing my son. A choice I could feel in my bones was the right one. And in doing so, I was breaking free from a pattern of guilt and self-sacrifice that had weighed me down for so long. I thought about my mom's plea that I give for the sake of keeping the family together, and my siblings' accusations that I'd let money go to my head. But I knew, without a doubt, that this decision wasn't rooted in selfishness. It was grounded in love, love for my son, love for the life I wanted to create for him, and, finally, a sense of love and respect for myself. I'd given so much to everyone else for years, now it was time to honor my own needs and dreams. With each financial plan, each carefully thought-out decision for my son's future, I felt a strength I hadn't known I had. I knew there would still be difficult conversations with my family, moments when the accusations would sting or the guilt would try to creep back in. But I had a newfound certainty that this path was the right one. In those quiet, reflective moments, I realized I was ready to move forward, not just with the winnings but with a new sense of purpose and peace. My son's future was secure. My priorities were clear, and for the first time, I felt fully empowered to live life on my terms. With my plans for the winnings set and my resolve firm, I knew it was time to address my family directly. The tension had grown too thick to ignore, and the barrage of messages and guilt-laden comments couldn't go unanswered any longer. I needed to set boundaries, clear, unshakable ones, if I was ever going to move forward in peace. I called my mom first, deciding that a calm, honest conversation was the best approach. After all, I didn't want this confrontation to devolve into anger or resentment. As much as her disappointment had hurt, I didn't want to lose our relationship entirely. When she answered, there was a guarded tone in her voice, like she was waiting for something, maybe an apology or an offer of compromise. But I couldn't give her either. "Mom," I began, steady but gentle, "I want you to know that I love you. And I've thought a lot about everything you, my brother, and my sister have been saying. But I need to be clear about something. This money is for my son and me. I've made plans that focus on his future, his needs, and our security, and I won't be changing those plans." There was a pause on her end, then a sigh that was heavy with resignation. "So that's it, then? You've made up your mind?" she asked, a hint of bitterness creeping in. "Yes, I have," I replied, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "It's not because I don't care about our family or because I don't value you all. But I've had to navigate a lot on my own over the years. I need to put my son's well-being and our future first. And this money gives me the chance to finally do that." She didn't respond immediately, but I could feel the weight of her disappointment from miles away. After a few moments, she finally spoke, her voice softer but still laced with that familiar sting. "I understand you want what's best for your son. But you should know that family is about more than just money. It's about being there for each other. I thought you'd want to strengthen those bonds, not break them." I took a deep breath, feeling the frustration bubble up but keeping it at bay. "Mom, I hear you, but that bond has to be mutual. I've been here, working hard to keep everything together for years. And it's been a lonely road. I can't ignore that. This isn't about breaking our family apart. It's about making sure my son has what he needs and that I can take care of him without the fear that's been my constant companion." Our conversation ended without resolution. The silence heavy but, for once, not oppressive. I'd said my truth, and she'd heard it, even if she didn't agree. In that quiet moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. I knew that her disappointment might not fade. But I was done letting it define my choices. Next, I tackled my siblings. Knowing these conversations would be harder. I knew they'd be blunt, even hurtful, in expressing their anger. And as expected, my brother didn't hold back. "So, you're really going to be that selfish?" he sneered when I told him the same thing I'd told my mom. "You'd rather keep it all for yourself than help us out? Even a little?" I stayed calm, reminding myself that his anger was rooted in his own expectations, not in anything I'd done wrong. "This isn't about being selfish," I said, my voice firm. "It's about priorities. For once, I'm choosing what's best for my son and me. I don't expect you to understand, but I do expect you to respect my decision." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Respect? That's rich. Coming from someone who's turned her back on her own family. I always thought you were better than this." His words stung, but I let them wash over me, untouched by the guilt he was trying to sow. This wasn't about being better or worse, it was about doing what I knew was right. And I refused to apologize for that. My sister's reaction was a similar mixture of hurt and anger. She accused me of forgetting the values we'd been raised with, of losing myself to greed. Each accusation felt like a thinly veiled attempt to manipulate me, to make me second-guess myself. But I stood firm. "Sis, you know my life has never been easy. And I've always tried to keep things civil between us," I told her. "But this money is finally giving me the chance to create a life of stability for my son. If that's something you can't accept, then that's your choice. But I won't feel guilty for doing what I know is right." I could tell my words didn't change her mind. And I knew she'd likely continue to paint me as selfish to anyone who would listen. But by the time the call ended, I felt lighter. I'd said what I needed to say. And if my siblings couldn't understand my perspective, then I could at least respect myself for being honest and setting boundaries that reflected my true priorities. In the days that followed, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't anticipated. The conversations had been painful. Yes. And I was sure there would be consequences, cold shoulders, missed calls, resentment that lingered for years. But I also felt free, unburdened by the need to please everyone around me. By drawing a line in the sand, I'd finally made it clear that my life, my choices, and my priorities belonged to me. I realized that, while I loved my family, their approval was no longer something I had to strive for. I didn't need to sacrifice my peace, my son's future, or my own happiness to meet their expectations. I was reclaiming the autonomy I'd quietly given up over the years. Building a foundation that honored my needs rather than everyone else's demands. The boundaries I'd set felt like a long overdue act of self-respect. A promise to myself that I would no longer allow guilt to control me. With each day that passed, I grew more confident in my decision, more at peace with the distance I'd placed between myself and the burdens of family expectations. I was finally free to live for myself and my son, building a future that wasn't weighed down by anyone else's needs or disappointments. And as I moved forward, I carried with me the quiet assurance that I had done what was right, for him. For me, and, in a way, for them too. In the weeks that followed those difficult conversations, life settled into a new kind of peace. My family's reactions had been painful to face, but with each passing day, I found myself feeling stronger, more certain that I'd made the right decision. I'd finally stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped second-guessing myself, stopped waiting for their approval. This newfound clarity felt like stepping into sunlight after years of standing in the shadows. For the first time, I felt an empowering sense of freedom to focus on my son without the weight of family expectations. Freedom to create a life that genuinely reflected my values and dreams. The guilt that once held me captive had lifted, replaced by a quiet resilience I hadn't known I possessed. There was a strength in standing firm, in knowing that my choices were my own and that they honored the path I wanted for myself and my son. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness, because the family I had once hoped for, the supportive, tight-knit group I had imagined, was something I'd had to let go of. But there was gratitude too, because this journey had shown me the people who truly cared, the ones who stood by me without condition or expectation, my friends, who had been there through thick and thin. were my chosen family, a testament to the fact that love and loyalty aren't bound by blood but by shared compassion and respect. My son, of course, remained my guiding star, the reason behind every decision I'd made. The money, while a blessing, was only a part of the story. What mattered most was the security and stability it would give him, a foundation for his future. Free from the fears that had once weighed me down. Knowing that I had the means to support him, to provide a life of opportunity and safety, filled me with a pride I couldn't put into words. The experiences of the past months had redefined my understanding of family, of loyalty, and of love. I realized that true family stands by you not out of obligation but out of genuine care. And as hard as it had been to set those boundaries with my biological family, I felt stronger for it. I had honored myself in a way I'd never done before, letting go of the compulsion to please everyone, and embracing my own worth. I still loved my family, even with the distance between us, and I hoped that one day they would come to understand my choices. Perhaps even respect them, but I was prepared for whatever came, knowing that I was no longer living for anyone else's expectations. I had my son, my friends, and, most importantly, a newfound trust in myself. For the first time, I felt whole, grounded in the life I was building. Moving forward, I carried the lessons I'd learned like precious gifts. I had learned to value myself, to protect my boundaries, and to stand firmly in my truth. And with those lessons, I knew I could face anything that lay ahead with grace, resilience, and a heart full of hope for the future. As I held my son close, watching him play without a care in the world, I felt the quiet joy of knowing that we were safe, loved, and, above all, free.